Hey everyone, I'm Julie Gunlock, your host for another episode of the Bespoke Parenting Hour. For those new to the program, this podcast is focused on how parents should custom tailor their parenting style to fit what's best for their families, themselves, and most importantly, their kids. So I think one of the issues that divides parents the most, especially in recent years, is the issue of guns and gun ownership. There's an awful lot of people out there who own firearms. They own them for a variety of reasons. Some may own a firearm because they live in a rural area. So rural, in fact, that if they were to call the police, if they needed them, they know that the police wouldn't be there for 10 to 15 minutes. Then, of course, people who live in a rural setting also want to be able to defend themselves against wildlife. If you live in the country, this is an actual reality. I think a lot of people who live in urban settings forget that. And it's not just super rural areas. My parents live in the western section of Virginia. It is a more rural area, but they live in a densely populated area in a neighborhood with, houses 10, 15, feet apart. And every once in a while, there's a wandering bear who comes into their neighborhood and rifles through someone's garbage. So wildlife is an actual concern for people, and that is another very valid reason that someone might own a gun. There's also the cases of women and single mothers, many of whom might have escaped an abusive relationship, and they want to protect themselves against that abuser and their children. Some people own firearms for far less depressing reasons. They like shooting sports like skeet and trap and sporting clays. Target practice with kids is really fun. And many families hunt and enjoy outdoor sports. And for these families, a lot of them want to carry on those traditions of teaching their children how to safely handle and use firearms. But then, of course, there are parents who do not want guns in their houses. They don't want their kids to use them. They don't want their kids to touch them. We should respect both sets of parents and how these parents choose to raise their kids. And no matter what your position is on gun ownership and gun rights, everyone, even children, should learn about gun safety. That is a critical component of raising kids, is teaching them about gun safety. And owners of guns need to learn gun safety as well and proper storage. So here to talk to me about this, and hopefully we'll get to some fun mom topics as well, is one of my favorite people in the world, Dana Loesch. Dana, of course, needs no introduction. She is a mom, a hugely popular radio host, a best-selling author, an advocate for the Second Amendment, and an all-around total badass. She is one of the bravest women I know. Dana, thanks for coming on.
Oh, my goodness. Well, thank you so much for having me, Julie. And it's good to be with you. I'm so excited that we actually get to talk because we see each other usually at like industry events and stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
So awesome.
Exactly. And I think the last time we saw each other was CPAC, of course. And there's always 1,000 people around. So I definitely want to tell, there's some stuff in the news, breaking news, HR 8 just passed, and we'll talk about that. But, you're a homeschooler, and I also want to talk about that. So I feel like it's going to be hard to keep this, to like a normal podcast amount of time, because I do feel like there's 1,000 things I want to talk to you about. But for the listeners who might not be as familiar, I am definitely, obviously, and, there are millions of people who are familiar with your story. But for those people who aren't familiar specifically with how you got involved in sort of the Second Amendment and the gun rights issue, did you grow up shooting? And then there's people who are interested in the gun issue or actually participate in shooting sports and that kind of stuff. But at what point did you start to advocate for gun owners?
That's a good question. And all of my family, we grew up with guns. I grew up with guns. My mom kept a 38 in her nightstand, and she didn't have any kind of biometric safe or anything like that to keep it in. She just had this face that looked like an eagle that she made when she would get mad. And that was basically our biometric. I mean, I never wanted that expression looking at me. But no, I grew up with firearms, and all my family's from Southern Missouri, and my all of my older cousins are mostly boys, and then it's like our family decided to have the girls then. Yeah. And my grandpa, they would, be outside, and the older boys rough and tumble, and they would, he would let them shoot his .22, or, they would all have their BB guns, and they would pick off little army men or soda cans or the Yoo-hoo cans, things like that. And it looks like fun. And so I wanted to do it. And my family, they're also huge hunters. And, my family today, we're huge hunters. And my grandfather went out all the time. He was an avid outdoorsman. He loved being outside. He liked being outside more than he liked being inside. And they would dress everything in the backyard, and I would watch. And, I was just always it was just fascinating, and it was interesting, and they just always included us. And my grandpa just saw me watching my cousins long enough. And so the first time I ever shot a rifle was with my grandfather in his backyard. And it didn't seem anything different or out of the ordinary. It's just, that's how life was. I mean, they lived, literally out in the sticks. They had a party line up until, oh my goodness, the late 90s. And for people who don't know what that is, like for the millennials, I'm a baby Gen Xer, so the millennials out there, that's when everybody had the same line, and you would pick up the phone to call somebody, and there's a conversation, and you would just have to wait until it was free. They had
now they call that Clubhouse, right?
Oh my gosh, that's right. Now that's coming back. It's just repackaged. It's Clubhouse. It's amazing how that comes back. So that's how we started. And so, then growing up and, going to school, going to college, as a young woman, it didn't really, I didn't really have time to be, to hunt at all. And I didn't have time to go outdoors. I was working 2 jobs and going to college full time. So I had no life. And I always supported the Second Amendment. And it's weird because you don't really think about the rights that you have until there is something usually negative that happens that causes you to really evaluate your priorities and really value those rights. And for me, it was when I started getting involved in radio. And when I got married, we had firearms in the house, and we have kids, and we kept things usually we stored things in a safe in our closet. And it wasn't until I wrote a column with the daily newspaper. I was a columnist there in St. Louis. And I mentioned it kind of in passing, just about firearms, and I was talking about parenting, but people got aggravated. They got really mad about it because they didn't think, the prevailing thought was, well, you can't be a parent and also have firearms in your house, which I thought, well, that's kind of the reason why I do, because my husband sometimes travels for work and I write from home. That was even before I got into radio. And I'm like, so, there's sometimes when I'm home for like half a week by myself, and we live in the city. So yeah, I kind of would like to be able to have that for self-defense. And that kicked off this like firestorm of controversy. And I ended up doing a morning show on radio, and then I got into radio. And then that's when it really kicked into gear, because you go into media, as you know this, and then it's like you put a proverbial target on your back, so to speak. And I think when we had people come to the house the first time, that's when I thought, oh my gosh, like it was different from hunting, and it was different from the way that I had always just sort of passively viewed my rights. It was, wow, I really do need this for self-defense. And I had the former police chief over in St. Louis tell me, you need to get your concealed carry license. Now, I grew up shooting rifles, and I didn't have a lot of experience with handguns. Right. So I was in my 20s starting from scratch, basically, with handguns. And it kind of went from there. And I wanted to be as knowledgeable as I could about how they worked and about what I was going to carry, because there's a lot of confidence that comes from knowledge. And I wanted to know absolutely everything about it. And I wanted to know the best way to carry. I wanted, everything. And I just asked as many people as I could. And I got into the range as often as my life and my kids would allow me to. And I kind of went from there, and I started speaking out about it more. And that's kind of how everything started. And then our kids, we educated our kids in the best way to, if you come across something that is left out, that a parent leaves out that they shouldn't have, this is how you need to react. And we demystified that when they were young so that they did not have this curiosity that could lead to something negative happening.
Yeah.
And so we armed them with that knowledge, so to speak. And that's how it started.
It's interesting that you talk about your experience and, obviously being threatened and having people, having the police chief saying, you need to get your concealed carry and all of this stuff. I mean, it's your experience. A lot of people don't experience that. I talked to, in my intro where I said, there's another reason some people may have firearms, and that's because they live in a very rural area and there are wild animals, right? Like that's one thing. And people in sort of, in an urban setting, like I know you live in a more urban area. And, I do too. And I find that a lot of the people around me, so I've written a lot about living in this deep blue city where it's not just that people that you're frowned upon if you own guns, like they don't even talk about guns. And it is, you are sort of bullied and isolated and made to feel like an alien if you own guns. So it is, it's very, when you talk about some people who grew up, understanding gun culture, there is none of that here. People think that guns are entirely unnecessary and don't consider that some people really do have valid reasons. I mean, I think you should be able to own a gun no matter what your reason is, but they won't even consider some of, what any normal rational person would see as a valid reason. And I think though, and also in my community, Moms Demand and these organizations, these anti-gun organizations are very active. And, we learned today that HR 8, and I want to talk to you about that, just passed. And this is this, increasing sort of background checks on private, for instance, if a family member, asks to borrow a gun or if you loan a gun to somebody. And I want to talk to you more about that. But I think sometimes the misinformation is intentional among these groups. Mm-hmm. It's because if I am someone who grows up or who lives in, for instance, my neighborhood where guns aren't talked about, nobody owns guns or at least admits it. There isn't really a hunting culture or any of that. And, you're not going to see kids in the backyard, pinging off cans or, shooting guns. There's this, like, why in the world would anyone need that? And then when you see the misinformation coming out from these groups, I've had a school board member in my town tell me that anybody can walk into a gun store and buy a machine gun. I once heard a neighborhood mom say, I was at a PTA meeting and she said it's easier to buy a gun than a loaf of bread. I mean, this stuff is passed off as fact, right? And none of that is corrected by, the only so-called authorities on guns, the mom demand groups, right? They never correct that information. And I think that's the point, that because when legislation comes down the pike, like HR 8, more background checks, of course you're going to get behind that if you think that you don't have to go through any kind of a background check to legally purchase a weapon. So, or a firearm. So tell me, one thing I would love to hear, and I think a lot of people are confused about this, is sort of walk me through the background check process. Like, what is, I guess answer the question. Can anyone, is it easier to buy a gun than a loaf of bread?
No, I've never had to go through any of that to buy bread. And if I make my own bread, and I wanted to sell massive amounts of bread that I made, I don't have to go and get a license for it either. That's such a reductive and insipid analogy, and I don't know why they feel like they need to talk down to women. But let's figure out something that women know. Bread, let's compare it to that. And HR 8. It's such a, as you mentioned this, this is such a dangerous piece of legislation because I don't even think it's not even actually expanding background checks. It's criminalizing private transfers, which there's no evidence at all whatsoever to suggest that any kind of increase in criminality that is done, any criminal act that's done in connection with a firearm, there's no evidence to support. In fact, there's evidence contrary that argues against that. It's, these individuals that are these criminals, these prohibited possessors that are getting these firearms through legal private transfers. I mean, they've done surveys of incarcerated felons, and the felons say, it's a straw purchase or we steal it. I mean, that's, the biggest thing. And sadly, where it concerns straw purchases, I mean, you're essentially falsifying your information on a 4473, which can be a felony, and we're not even really prosecuting all of those. But the problem with HR 8 is you're expanding an already faulty system. And that's what a lot of people don't really, people who are not as familiar with it as they should be, they don't realize this. And I was actually talking about this on my program today after the news came out that this went through the House, and I don't know how it's going to fare in the Senate.
Right.
But, when you have employers that conduct background checks, you have an employer that has to use more information to make sure that they are looking at the right person to evaluate you as a worthy prospective employee, more so than what the ATF looks at. I mean, the ATF, it's suggested that you provide your Social Security number, but that's a formality. It's not necessarily required, nor is it really necessarily used to evaluate whether someone can even go and buy a gun. So that's insane that an employer actually takes more time and looks at more information than the ATF does when evaluating whether or not you are a lawful carrier or a purchaser. And I mean, this is a natural right versus something that is not a natural right. You don't have a natural right to employment with somewhere. So that's the fact that all of these people that claim that they care so much about the system, they won't even do the minimal amount to kind of improve this overburdened and faulty system is a problem. But the straw purchases, when people are lying about who they're buying it for or the purpose, we're not even prosecuting those. I think, and there's been a lot of articles about this, but I mean, you have, in addition to this, the lack of this identifying information creates thousands of false positives. So you have, James O'Keefe, he tried to purchase a firearm, and that kickback is a false positive. They only go by whether names are similar and birth dates, and that's kind of how they evaluate it. So you have millions of people that are initially denied a right because of this false positive that this faulty system spits out. And then of that, I think 1 year they reduced it down to 44 actually who shouldn't have been allowed or who falsified. And then they had, of that, only 6 of them were actual felons, prohibited possessors that were dumb enough to actually fill out a form.
Yeah.
But then they only prosecute a fraction of those. So, but they still don't answer the question of, so when these regulations fail to stop the bad guys, what's the backup plan to that? Because criminals, if they're going to want guns, if they're going to get a gun, they're going to get a gun. It just means that a law-abiding person is going to have to take more time.
That's exactly right. None of this is meaningful change. None of this is meaningful in terms of stopping the, 300 people in Chicago who, died over the weekend and, children that are caught in crossfire on the streets. None of this is going to change that. There's another bill.
And I was going to add just real quick that those private transfers are already federally regulated. So there's a reason why, that's the reason why there's a penalty. If you buy a handgun in one state and go across state lines to your state of residence, there's a reason why there's a penalty for that, because that stuff is already federally regulated. So I feel like, just to touch on a point that you made, you said that, either they're purposefully misleading. They are. They act like these laws don't exist.
Yeah. There's another bill that's working its way through 1446. Tell me about how that will. You read the media. You read the media reports. So this will stop the loophole that allowed this shooter to get a gun or that shooter to get a gun. But tell me, this is taking away. It really will delay potentially permanently people's ability to get a gun. Tell me a little bit about that bill.
No, I think that you hit the nail on the head. It does. A right delayed is a right denied.
Yes.
And so HR 1446, this legislation is based on the false premise about the Charleston massacre, that this particular murderer was able to purchase a firearm because of a loophole. Well, there isn't a loophole. Everything is so completely regulated. There are no loopholes. The FBI didn't need more days to accurately identify that this individual was a prohibited possessor in their custody. What they needed was a competent director and to not follow idiotic protocol for verifying applicants. And that's the thing, because when they used the NICS system, and they actually only just in 2018, I think it was in July 2018, did they finally start using what's called INDEX, IN-DEX, and that's a more comprehensive criminal database that it was created in 2008, but it contains a lot more information than the NICS system does. Mm-hmm. So NICS, when they were running these background checks, I mean, these individuals, they're not allowed to they have policies that ban Google searches. So you can't, and that's what happened in this instance. This individual would have been stopped immediately if the individual running the check was able to actually verify the arresting county in his previous felony drug charge. And that he was already a prohibited possessor before he ever bought the gun that he used in the massacre. But because they were only limited to certain things to use, they couldn't identify the department in the county. And so it was FBI error. That wasn't a loophole. That was FBI error. Yeah. And so there are the 10-day waiting period. So what 1446 does is it extends the time that you're waiting for a background check. Well, that doesn't do anything. If the system's faulty, it's not going to do anything. Right. You have to be able to use all the tools at your disposal. And like I said, he would have been able to, be stopped instantly if it wasn't a human error on this. But, to that point, when you talk about how this has such an impact on people, I always go back to this awful story. And I know that there are more like this, but I made mention of this online today, and who was it? I think it was Representative Heiss who was on the floor talking about this. And this journalist with Vox said, well, it sounds like if you're that much afraid for your life that you need to be able to access a firearm, like right now, that night, that you should call the police. Well, it was an interesting narrative because I thought we were defunding the police.
Defunding the police.
We've gone from, defunding the police to, call the police.
Yeah,
well,
exactly.
Even then, Castle Rock Gonzalez, you don't have to. The police are not obligated to save your life. And the average response time is anywhere from 10 to 18 minutes. So you got to basically pray for 10 minutes. But my gun is going to be there before police are there. I wasn't home at the time, thankfully, but I had somebody who really did not like me that tried to break into my home. And I had Fort Worth police call, and our neighbors were calling the police. And my husband said, if my wife had been home or if I had been home, we were doing kid stuff. He goes, this would have been a very different call. Yeah. And Fort Worth said, yeah, we know that. We're very well aware because, my gun's there before the cops are. Right. But there's a story in 2015 in New Jersey. A woman named Carol Brown was trying to get away from a very, very abusive ex-boyfriend. And she went and she followed every rule, every piece of protocol. She followed everything that New Jersey told her to follow. And she filled out her paperwork dutifully. And she waited that 30-day waiting period, which on average, those periods are even longer than advertised in New Jersey. It actually is more towards 2 months. Oh. And as she was waiting for the state to acknowledge her lawful right to carry a gun, she was stabbed to death in her driveway by that violent ex-boyfriend. And he took advantage of the state's waiting period to murder her outside. And now, you said what is so enraging
about this is HR 8. So let's say Carol Brown had a friend, right, or a family member who could say, look, I'm going to loan you this, her older brother, younger brother, whatever, cousin, I'm going to loan you this handgun just until you get through this, until you get, your background check. Now that is not an option. This is anti-woman. This is these measures are fundamentally anti-woman. And I don't understand of course I understand where the women's groups are, right? They're staying quiet for the current administration. But this is so tragic that you have cases like this where, okay, she still might have been able to get some, a firearm to protect herself through a family member, but no more. No more.
No more. No. And I think you're spot on with this being anti-woman. I mean, I think that these sorts of gun laws are discriminatory in nature anyway, because they are biased against the groups that need them the most.
Yes. And another group of them and another group that's going to fall victim to the defund the police group is the African-American community, people who live in urban settings. On this podcast, actually last week, I interviewed Sylvia Bennett Stone, who works with the Woodson Center, and she is trying to get the word out. Sylvia's 17-year-old daughter was caught in crossfire and killed, I think about 18 years ago. It might be 17 years ago, but a tragic event in her life. And she is trying to say, if there had been a police presence at that gas station where her daughter was standing when these young men got in a fight, her daughter might be alive today. And she is so appalled. She is so appalled by the defund the police movement. And it was funny when I interviewed her, I said, Sylvia, I've never experienced what you've experienced, for one thing. And secondly, I don't have a lot of experience in communities because I live in a very safe area. And I said, I don't have a lot of experience in living in an area that has a lot of crime. And then I told her, it occurred to me that neither do the people who are demanding defunding the police. It's all people who live in comfortable areas, that are, city council members who have houses in very, either gated communities or safe areas of a city. And so what's so sad is so many of these measures are going to really harm the most vulnerable, the people who really do need to protect themselves. It's just tragic.
Yeah, that goes right into McDonald v. Chicago, because Otis McDonald, who by the way is a natural rights, I don't say civil because he's not granted these rights by anyone, but a natural rights icon. And this is an older gentleman. He was like in his 70s, I think. He's passed away since, but he lived in Chicago. He lived in I forget where, I think Morgan Park, but he lived in Chicago, and he was tired of seeing his neighborhood. He watched it from going from, to this peaceful neighborhood to being taken over by gangs and robberies. And he watched as people he knew were robbed, and he had hunted. He knew his way around firearms. He was experienced, but he had to fight the city for his right. And that's the thing, whether it's a rural community or whether it's, in the city, individuals need to be able to protect themselves. And it's always, it's always the people that need them the most that these policies, these restrictive policies, they hit them the hardest. And the HR 8, the background, the criminalization of private transfers, by having universal background checks too, this is something else. They're treating everyone like a de facto FFL, federal firearms licensee.
Yeah, exactly.
So, what Democrats aren't answering in this legislation is, okay, so is everyone going to have a license, or is everyone going to be able to access the system? Because so far, you got to have that license or be in law enforcement to even do that, and then you have to have a certain type of license to do that. Or are you asking people, because in some states it's actually kind of expensive and it can become prohibitively so, to go to a gun store or another FFL and do a transfer and process it. That can be quite expensive. So it's economically discriminatory. I think it is anti-woman. I think it's anti-minority, because gun control has its racist roots going back to Roger Taney and the Dred Scott decision in St. Louis. So the people who've always been on the wrong side of history are still on the wrong side of history with us.
I want to pivot a little bit to the mom issue here, and sort of, because I think I sometimes feel overwhelmed, and I don't know how to react to some of the things that I see in my community. And I don't know, also, sometimes people come to me in my community and say, how do I get more information on this or that? And I do my best. But, I live in a deep blue city where there is no gun culture. People just generally don't talk about it. And you've got a very active moms demand sort of community here. And look, they are, I think most people know sort of Shannon Watts and her sort of approach to things, which is bullying and making people feel, bad. And there's no conversation, there's no argument. And that's sort of what I have seen, sadly, from a lot of the folks in my community. And so, but then you get women who sort of quietly come up to you and say, I'd like some information on concealed carry. I'm interested in getting one. I have a friend who's, who's involved in real estate, and she's, and I'm sorry, my dog is now going crazy. Who's involved in real estate, and she gets nervous going into these homes. I have a person who's asked me, my teenage son is, interested in possibly, getting involved in some, sporting clays, or he'd like to shoot some trap. So what do you tell people who don't live in an area? What resources are out there? I know NRA does some great stuff, but, more than just for little kids, what advice would you give someone where, there's no shooting range in my community. There's no sort of support. There's no clubs. Even the Boy Scouts don't do it as much in this community. Yeah. So I'm wondering, is there something that you would, any advice you would give to someone? on this?
Perhaps less realistically, I would say, well, you need to move.
Oh my God. Okay, wait. I know I should let you answer. But honestly, Dana, I spent an unhealthy amount of time on Zillow and real estate, apps, scrolling through things So yes. Okay. But minus moving. Okay. Let's minus moving.
Minus that. There used to be a number of schools. Well, I think a lot of schools don't even have them anymore. I know here in Texas, we do, but there used to be rifle teams. And in absence of rifle teams, you used to be able to have, like 4-H or do something like that. Scouts used to do it. As far as, women are concerned, when my mom wanted to go and get her concealed carry license, and she wanted to buy her very first, non-revolver handgun, I suggested to her to check out the Well-Armed Woman, which I love the work that Carrie Lightfoot, all those ladies do, because they are such an asset. Because my mom lives in St. Louis, and here I am in Dallas, so I couldn't really get to her as easily. But they had a chapter at the gun range that was my home gun range when we lived up there, and so my mom went there, and she was able to meet up with some of the well-armed women and find a really good. Not that she had anything good against the male instructors, but women carry differently from men, and she wanted to learn the basics from someone who would carry like she did and who would understand some of the concerns that she had because they experienced those and were active in figuring out, best practices for it. And she grew in her confidence and her know-how, and which is awesome. And she loves the empowerment, the real true empowerment that comes from knowing that you have the ability, the skill set and the confidence to carry that skill set out should you need to keep yourself and your family safe. And I think it reduces the fear, and but it's been great for her. But that's one of the first things that I would say to women out there is you need to find a Well-Armed Woman chapter and join up with those ladies.
That's a great thing. And I know the NRA has Eddie the Eagle, and there are other programs geared towards kids. But it really is kind of sad around here when people, and I think they do truly believe that the only thing they want to talk about is when it comes to guns is that how unnecessary they are, how they shouldn't even be talked about, how they shouldn't even be seen. And I think, in fact, I worry about those parents. I worry about children because I think knowledge and understanding, safe use of guns, safe storage, I think too, since COVID, we know that people are buying more firearms. I mean, the data on that is
the defund the police call started.
Yes, exactly. And what's interesting too is I just read an article in Forbes, I think it was yesterday, about how every time people, when the checks go out, the support checks go out, the gun sales go up. So I think people are spending some of that money because they feel, with police forces. Also, it's not just to fund the police. It's that the police, I think, are feeling reticent to be maybe as aggressive in certain, maybe if there's a domestic violence call or something like that. I feel like people are worried that the police might not respond in the way that they need them to. So I think that's why people are, purchasing more firearms. I also think that, but I worry also about kids, this sort of kids who, heaven forbid they come across one, a complete ignorance of these things and not being told, the rules about this, like the Eddie the Eagle program and other safety programs, you need to teach your kids about, what to do if they come across a gun, not just not talk about it.
And NSSF has some great programs with that too. They have different scheme videos, and they also have Project Child Safe, which is great. And I always recommend Project Child Safe to the friends of mine, especially when my kids were a lot younger, that they wanted to pretend that guns didn't exist, but they knew that they really couldn't. So, and then finally, when they were moved to, they felt prevailed upon to finally get their first firearm because they would see crime going up or they'd defund police calls. I was like, well, get training and also, check out Project Child Safe too with NSSF. But there are a lot of good options, but honestly, still the best thing I think is an engaged parent, because I always tell everybody I know, what your kid does not learn inside your home, they will learn outside of it. And just as you would teach your kid not to run out on the highway or touch a burning pot or a hot pot or anything like that, I mean, these are basic common sense life skills. And I think knowledge about firearms, even if you are a parent is entirely opposed to guns, and they have the right to do that. They have the right to not support it. But I still think it is incredibly important that kids have anything about firearms demystified, and that they understand that there's no backspace key. There's no undoing it. There's, this is what this is, and educate them on this is proper handling. This is how this is done.
Yeah.
And so that way they don't, you don't have to worry if they're at someone else's house, and you don't have to worry about how your child would react should someone else not be maybe as responsible as you are with stuff.
I'm glad you brought up the NSSF. I want to just mention that is the National Shooting Sports Foundation. Dana is absolutely right. Look them up. They have great programs, not just for kids too. So that's I'm glad that you mentioned that. You mentioned if a child goes to another person's house, and I want to just I actually really want to talk about homeschooling, and we'll get that to that in just a sec. But I have one more question. The Moms Demand Action has this "Do you have guns in the house?" campaign, right? And and the point is it encourages moms to ask that question before allowing their children to come over. And I always feel like and living in this community, I feel like it's not really intended to educate or, to check on things. I think it's a way to isolate families, gun-owning families in certain communities.
No, I think so too.
Yeah, and it's a way to shame them. And I actually wrote about this. I have to say, not to interrupt you, but I get so sad about this particular thing because I look at it like this. I will not, I'm fine. Whatever makes parents feel comfortable is fine. But I also don't think that anyone who knows less than a very informed woman about firearms and her Second Amendment rights, anyone that knows less than that woman should not be dictating policy or what she does or does not do inside of her home and with her kids. Yeah. And, so I feel you on that. Yeah, this was, I swear I could go off on this tangent for hours, but there was the Moms Demand Action chapter in my town, and the PTA, which, by the way, someone needs to do like a really investigation into the PTA, because that organization has gone so far left, and their national policy, they basically want more restrictive gun laws. They, you name it, it's basically, I feel like they become an arm of Moms Demand, and it's very frustrating. But in my town, and I'm not saying that of all PTA chapters, but certainly the national PTA endorses all of this. And my particular PTA, in my town, co-hosted with the Moms Demand chapter this gun safety event, which was it ended up being kind of comical to watch, mostly because they lifted the NSSF, Project Child Safe entirely, and then kind of got certain things wrong. So it was kind of amusing to watch. But I think that like I said, that it was really. They use that sort of, do you have a firearm in your home, as a way to sort of, it's almost like a mini registry to identify who has the firearm and sort of isolate that family or make that family in certain communities. And it's really depressing, because I think that it is important that, and this again, this is why it's so important to teach children about gun safety. Because, like you said, there's no back button. And if they see something and they're not educated, or they find a gun and they're not educated and they don't understand, that is extremely dangerous. So I just really hope that parents who might be, anti-firearm, and they are all excited about HR 8 and HR 1446, I hope that they at least are teaching their children and these safety measures, because I think too often it's like, I'm against, and we're not going to talk about guns. And that really frightens me. But
I would be more with some of these Moms Demand, I think, and to this point, I think that some of the members of Moms Demand, I think, concern me more than what law-abiding parents do when they have firearms. What was it in Harris County? They had that one. She was I think it was the leader of the Texas chapter. Yeah. She ended up actually getting charged with disorderly conduct because she was screaming at 2 young girls in a cookie store because they were wearing Trump shirts.
Oh my God, that's right.
She was screaming slang for women's genitalia that I will not repeat until I accompany on this podcast.
It's a family-friendly podcast.
Yeah, and this woman was one of the heads of it, and I've seen, I've watched as moms demand, they try to ironically advocate for disarmament of women by actually trying to collude with abusers to do so. I mean,
100%.
There's a whole story there too.
Yes, there is. Yes, there is.
Yeah, I mean, that to me is, and I'm glad that you mentioned that they ripped off Project Child Safe. They ripped off Project Child Safe, and then while they were giving this demonstration about firearms, they ended up flagging everyone in the room and watching some of the video for that. So it's like they're people who are leading the safe handling and safe storage actually needed lessons on it.
Yeah, well, and in the lobby at my event, my PTA event, they had I should say joint event, they had gun locks in the lobby that they were just saying, hey, take one, which was hilarious because, I thought they didn't want us to have guns, but fine. And the locks were just like a generic lock. They don't even fit. They're not, you have to have a lock that fits the firearm. So they were handing things out like refrigerator magnets. And I'm sitting there and I'm asking, I said, hey, what does this fit? Which gun? Is this for a Glock? Is this for, like, I'm asking questions. And of course, like, they get this like sort of, scared look on their face. And I'm like, this is not safe to give out to people, to suggest it will. It's just, this is like what we're dealing with here. They don't know anything. And again, I feel like that was actually unintentional. Like they didn't know, but I feel like that group intentionally misinforms so that when legislation comes down, like HR 8, people are like, oh, since it's as easy to buy a gun as it is a loaf of bread, and anyone, even felons, can buy guns, then wow, we need this. It's just intentional. It's creating a need when there isn't. It's creating this false sense that there's a need when there's no need at all. So, Dana, I love talking to you about this stuff, but I cannot. This is purely personal. I want to have a conversation about this because I am homeschooling this year. It is my first year, but you've done this for years. Did you?
I did. Yeah.
Yeah. I want to hear, because see, it's so interesting. I feel like it's very like the end thing to do now. Everybody's homeschooling, right? But you've done it. You did it for years. So why did you do it? What happened, or what made you think, okay, I'm going to homeschool my kids? I'm always interested in people's sort of stories.
I can't remember where it was that I read it. My memory is failing me now as to who actually said it, but something like the first 7 years of a child's life, that's when you really reinforce their character and you set in stone that foundation that's going to kind of shape how they grow and who they are for the rest of their lives. And for the most impressionable years of my children's lives, I'm like, I am the parent. I carry these children for 9 months.
Right.
We were up with these kids. We as their parents are going to be the biggest influences in their lives until they become their own adults and they're able to handle things on their own. And I also think that, as a parent, one of our jobs is to, find that skill that our kids are blessed with and have them, nurture them and help them recognize it and just act as a facilitator so that they can do what they need to do to grow with that.
Yeah.
And just because I enjoy being with them, and we joined a co-op in Missouri, and so from my oldest was homeschooled up until 8th grade, and then when we moved to Texas, we the church that we went to, my son was interested in checking out this Christian school, so we did, and he wanted to go there, and then my youngest son was like not going to get left out, so he was home educated for a less amount of time than my oldest one was, but he was up until about 4th grade.
Oh, that's great. And
then they went to their Christian school. My oldest son is in college now. He's going into law. So which makes some sense. My youngest thinks that college is a racket, and he thinks that he's my national Latin scholar, and he's an honor roll kid, and he thinks that honor roll is dumb because it's just conditioning kids for acceptable behavior, and it doesn't mean anything when you're an adult. And he's hysterical. So he's going to go and be a computer programmer. That's what he wants to do. He has his life all planned out. But no, we did it. And they're very, my kids are immovable mountains, which is good. And that's what we wanted. We wanted kids who knew the difference between right and wrong, who, honored their parents and treated others kindly and stick up for those who need defending and defend their ideals, and to be absolutely immovable when everyone else was malleable. And so that's what we focused on. And, you know, I'm really proud of the young men that they're becoming, and they're also super smart. I mean, it's a lot of fun. I mean, and not everyone can do it, and it's definitely not for everybody, but if people can, and it is for them, I mean, it's, you know, families know how to best.
They do. And, you know, and I think,
and the lessons are so fun.
Well, I think they are so fun, but I will say one thing. I think that since I just started this year, you know, I've come into a homeschooling environment that was, has really advanced. It's really developed. There's a lot now that sort of provide you with a lot of guidance. And when I talk to people who I've talked to, you know, when I was going through sort of this journey to decide, I was talking to some women who, you know, did it way back in the 80s and 90s, you know, and homeschooling their kids that are now my age. And, you know, they said that there weren't these sort of sets of curriculum. They sort of had to, you know, put it together themselves. And so it was a lot harder. So I always mention to people that homeschooling, there are what they call school in a box. You know, it's like it comes with the entire curriculum and a guidebook, and it really helps you through it. So I feel like people who did it years ago, even 10 years ago, didn't have as many resources. But I think homeschooling has taken off to a point now that they make it much easier on people who want to start. So I hope more people look into this. And I think you're right. It's not for everybody, but I think there are an awful lot of people who think it'll be too hard. But there's systems out there that make it very easy. I appreciate you coming on this parenting podcast. It means a lot.
No, this was good. Fun discussion, Julie. I enjoyed it.
Well, and I hope you'll come back on. Certainly the Biden administration will be giving us a lot to talk about in the gun space. So I hope to have you. I hope to have you on again soon. Thanks, Dana.
Thanks, Julie. Take care.
You know, I mentioned several times during the discussion with Dana that in my community, you know, you just don't talk about guns. It's just not something. Even there's even reluctance for kids to play with guns. You know, I always get nervous when the kids take their Nerf guns up to the school or up to this park near our house. I get kind of nervous because that's the culture up here. It's just, you know, guns are just frowned upon in every form. So it's interesting. I was reading this article a couple days ago, and it was really interesting. They showed a picture of very little kids, probably in kindergarten, first grade. And the picture was from 1925. And the article was saying that it was a scene from Hobby Fair at Burroughs Elementary School, which is somewhere in Minneapolis. And again, this is 1925. And what the hobby fair was it was like show and tell. It was an opportunity for the kids to share their hobbies with their classmates. So the image shows one little girl on the end painting. There's another little girl decorating a cake. Another little boy is tinkering with a radio set. But then there's this little boy in the middle who is clearly showing off his firearm collection. He has a couple of firearms, and he's holding up what looks like a rifle. And so it's kind of a shocking picture. When I saw it, I was sort of shocked. Now, the person who wrote this story said, you know, it could have been a Red Ryder BB gun, you know, like the one in A Christmas Story, but who knows? And that doesn't really matter, because the idea of bringing in either a real firearm or or even a toy gun into a classroom today is so foreign a concept. And not just like in dense area, you know, densely populated urban areas. I'm talking about anywhere in the country. That is just such a no-no. It's just very interesting to think of how the culture has changed towards guns and how sort of how it's become this, you know, it's verboten, of course, on a school grounds. And I'm not saying that's bad. Like, I don't really want kids running into the classroom with a gun, but, you know, certainly a little boy showing off, you know, either a toy or a real gun. Maybe he hunts with his father. Seems a little bit young to be doing that. But it does show, again, how far that we have gone. So I really thank Dana for coming on and chatting on that issue and on gun safety, gun storage, and other issues of concerns, particularly with the legislation that just passed this week. Thanks, everyone, for being here for another episode of the Bespoke Parenting Hour. If you enjoyed this episode or like the podcast in general, please leave a rating or review on iTunes. This helps ensure that the podcast reaches as many listeners as possible. If you haven't subscribed to the Bespoke Parenting Hour on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts, please do so you won't miss an episode. Don't forget to share this episode and let your friends know that they can get Bespoke episodes on their favorite podcast app. From all of us here at the Independent Women's Forum, thanks for listening.